Well, first, I want to say it is such an honor to share the stage with you, Dr. Biden. Women always get first billing on the Women of the Year stage, and also you, Vice President Biden. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
I'm Jill's husband, I understand.
Thank you, Jill's husband. You've written a really lovely memoir. It's called Promise Me Dad, A Year of Hope, Hardship, and Purpose. If I'm not mistaken, it hits stores tomorrow. I really recommend you all read it. It's soulful and touching and gets to some of the most profound issues that I think we as humans experience. And in it, you chronicle the tragic loss of your son, Beau, in 2015. And you talk about how relying on a sense of purpose, both a commitment to your family and a commitment to your country, got you through that. So I'd love to start by hearing more about the phrase, promise me, Dad. When Beau said that to you, Mr. Vice President, what was he referring to?
We lost our son, our eldest son. And how many of you have had someone in your family you've lost to cancer? Well, you all understand. You all understand. And we wanted to make sure that our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren knew what an incredible man our son was, and about courage and commitment. And so I was asked by the President of the United States, Barack Obama, my buddy, I was asked, well, he is my buddy. He is my buddy. I was asked early on, how did I want to spend the rest of my life? And I told him that I wanted to spend the rest of my life, I'd answer that question the same way when I was 28 as I am my age now. I wanted to do something that would make a difference. And so, and when Beau was dying, and he knew he was dying, he had stage 4 glioblastoma, which is what killed Teddy Kennedy, and our great personal friend John McCain is working like hell to try to overcome. Fighting. And what happened was that Beau knew how much his mom and I adored him, and Beau would always say, Dad, look at me, look at me. When they ask about me, smile, Dad. Don't look sad, Dad. No matter what happens, Dad, I'm going to be okay, but you got to promise me, promise me you'll be okay. What he meant by that was he knew we'd take care of the family, but he wanted to make sure that I continued to do the things that I cared so deeply about, that I stayed involved in public policy, not running for office, just stayed involved. And so because of his encouragement, I took a job as a professor at Penn, where I do a lot of foreign policy. Delaware, I do a lot of domestic policy. There's a forum down there, there's a Biden Institute down there, and then Jill and I have a Biden cancer initiative that we're working on. So Beau was saying, Dad, I don't want you to turn inward. I don't want you to step back. I know you'll be with the family, but I want you to stay engaged, continue to try to change things. And that was the promise me, Dad.
I know that's such a difficult balance to strike. How do you take care of your own mental health at a moment like that? And Dr. Biden, in the book, you know, there's a discussion of how when the vice president was throwing himself so much into his work at that time, you had to tell him, take a step back, slow it down. What was that like?
Well, I feel, I know in my own life and in Joe's and in my family's life, I think it's so important that you find a place that you can find a sense of balance. And I felt that for Joe, and even I tell him this now, that, you know, for me, it's going to bar class every day and running. And I needed Joe to kind of slow down, to just get off the treadmill, which is really hard, by the way, when you're going through something so difficult. And even after Beau died and going through grieving, I mean, the way I preserved myself was going to my exercise class every morning, and that's why when this woman was out here, and I just could put myself in that moment where I just could feel that I could have calm, and so I think that's what I'd like to give to all the women here in the audience. You have to take care of yourself first to be able to handle whatever you're given, and also to give strength to other people, because that's so important that you can lift up others. So take care of yourselves.
Mr. Vice President, you just touched on your relationship with President Obama. I think we actually may have a picture of the two of you here. You appeared to be, I didn't show a meme. You appear to be famously close, and I'm curious about, so many of us grow close to the people we work with. Was there a moment when your relationship sort of shifted from being, very close colleagues to really feeling like family?
Well, I think it was. It's going to sound silly, but I think it happened the night that we were about to be nominated officially. And we were in Denver. And we have 5 grandchildren, but the 3 by our number 2 son are very the same age as Barack's daughters. And so my little one, Finnegan Biden, who is now a freshman at the University of Pennsylvania, came to us and said, "Hey, Pops," she said, can we take that room and maybe have," and she called Barack and his kids.
They were little then.
No, they were little. She was, this is almost 10 years ago, and said, "And can we clear out the room, and can we have Barack and his kids and his cousin and their cousins come and sleep with us?" So Jill checked with Michelle. She thought it was a great idea. So I remember as we were leaving, opening the door, I come out of the civil rights movement and looking and seeing these little children, black and white, in the same sleeping bags with each other. And as we headed off for a new adventure, and I looked and I thought, this is really going to work. And what happened was that our number 2 daughter is the very best, closest friend of Barack's. Our number 3 granddaughter and Barack's number 2 daughter are each other's best friends. And
If you're following all this.
But here's my point. They vacation together, the way they spend time at our house and with Barack. And so it just grew closer and closer. And I watched a man, you watch a man or a woman under intense pressure, and you get a measure of what their character is. And I saw this guy, and he has enormous character. And
As does Michelle.
And so we just it got closer and closer, and we really are really very close personal friends.
It's one of those magic sort of relationships that, we didn't really know each other that well before we were in the administration, but we really got to know each other. We definitely respected one another, and it grew into love. I mean, we love one another, and
it's the same values.
it felt like a family.
I think we
Michelle's
have a picture of
mom.
you too.
Michelle's mom, Mrs. Robinson, I kid, but I'm not kidding. She could have been my mom. Not a joke. Same value set.
They have the picture.
Yeah.
There you go.
If you want to write a caption for this one, go for it.
What do you think they're doing now?
Where are they?
So, Dr. Biden, one of the things that I think a lot of women really related to about you was that you were the first spouse of a vice president. I'm using that phrase because I really hate the phrase second lady.
I hated it too. It's so archaic.
Right?
Tell them what you call yourself.
Captain of the vice team.
I like that. All right, Captain Biden, you were the first spouse of a vice president to hold a paying job teaching English full-time at a community college in Virginia while your husband went to work in the White House every day. And I would love to hear why it was important for you to do that and whether it was a difficult decision at any point.
It wasn't difficult at all, and it was one that Joe fully supported. And, I had worked hard. I mean, I raised our 3 children while Joe was working, and I went and got...
Well, she was working,
yes.
too.
And and I taught full-time, so it took me...
Got 2 master's degrees and 1 doctorate degree. While she was working at night.
So when we were elected, I said, Joe, I can't, live your life of politics. I've got to do what makes me happy, what makes, my passion. So 5 days after the inauguration, I was in the classroom. I'm still in the classroom, and I taught full time. So that's what makes me happy. So You
That
have to
makes
follow
me
your
happy.
passion.
Mr. Vice President, I want to turn to the news. It's probably an understatement to say that there has been a barrage of accusations against many men in positions of power, from young women who are coming forward, young and old women coming forward and telling their stories of sexual harassment, sexual abuse. One of the defenses that you occasionally hear is that, well, these men grew up in a different time.
Oh, give me a break.
Well, I think we all heard that Harvey Weinstein's lawyer initially said, well, that he was an old dinosaur learning new ways.
You
You
should
grew up in
spend
that
some
era.
time in jail as an old dinosaur. Look, folks, I'm sure it's a shock to you. I'm part of that generation, okay? And I was raised by a gentle, decent man who said, my dad, everybody thinks because my passion from writing the Violence Against Women Act is that maybe my mother was abused or someone close to me. It's not true. It was my dad. My dad used to say that the greatest sin anyone could commit is the abuse of power. And the cardinal sin of all is for a man to raise his hand to a woman or a child. It's not about, this is about the abuse of power. It's about the abuse of power. And the idea that we are giving anybody a pass on any of this, you guys are going to change the culture here. We're on the cusp of fundamentally changing the culture. Women hold up half the sky, and guess what? It's time this ends. And I really, for the first time, when I wrote the legislation over 20 years ago, I said at the time, we have to change the culture. Y'all know what the phrase rule of thumb means? Yeah, well, most people didn't. It means in the late 1300s, the English common law courts, too many women were dying by being beaten by their husband. They said a husband could no longer chastise his wife with a rod bigger than the circumference of their thumb. This is a cultural problem. But we're on the cusp because so many brave women have come forward. It's hard to come forward. It's hard to come forward. And they're going to change it. So don't let this slow up. This is time to fundamentally, I mean this literally, not figuratively, change the culture of how women are treated in American society.
And what do you think, because I hear you say that this is a moment, this is a turning point. What will make the culture actually turn? Because certainly we've heard many of these accusations many times before.
Well, but what you haven't heard three things. Number one, until the act was written, nobody felt the pressure out there. So what the real change was when that football player dragged his wife out of an elevator by the hair, the woman who helped me write the Violence Against Women Act went to work for the NFL to begin to change that culture because we kept focusing on what was happening. And so the more women who come forward and make it real to everybody, if I can make an analogy, your generation has always been good with same-sex marriage. But when I came out publicly, I always had that view, but when I came out publicly and said, I think same-sex marriage makes sense, you marry who you love, my dad used to say, look, it doesn't matter, it's who you love, you marry who you love. And when that began to happen, look at the change that's taken place, not because of me, because all of a sudden it legitimized every man out there who wasn't a homophobe to begin to speak up. If you had a luncheon here in the city of New York with a lot of high-powered men and a gay waiter walked by with a lisp and said something, and one of the folks at the lunch 5 years ago said, well, let me tell you what I want. No one would say anything. Today, somebody do that, they wouldn't be invited back. The culture's changing. And the culture's changing with women because so many brave women, knowing they were going to be vilified coming forward, knowing it. Anybody thinks it's easy for a woman to stand up before the whole world and say, I was abused? I ask men, how many of you would stand up? How many of you would stand up and go forward? So look, it's really, we're on the cusp here. This is totally different. Look at all these men have rightfully lost now. $1 million contracts. That wouldn't have happened a year ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. So keep pushing.
There have been a recent mini barrage of charges by women members of Congress talking about sexual harassment of members and their staffers. You spent 3.5 decades in Congress. Did you see this? Were you aware that women were having a hard time?
No, I was. And by the way, when I personally wrote the Violence Against Women Act, and initially women's groups didn't support it because they thought it would take the focus off of choice and off of gender issues. But then they got fully behind it, and the people who supported me most are my friends like Barbara Boxer and Dianne Feinstein and all the women in the Senate. I remember getting on the elevator and seeing Strom Thurmond pat, Well.
But it happens everywhere.
Well,
I mean, it happens
It
everywhere.
happens everywhere. But well, you got to talk about it.
I want to go back to purpose. I want to go back to purpose. You know, you've talked about finding it in your work, but it, of course, you know, we all find purpose in our closest relationships as well, and you two seem to have such a tight relationship. I think we have a picture of the two of you here on the screen somewhere. I absolutely love this. You celebrated your 40-year wedding anniversary recently.
I think it was 100, wasn't it, Joe?
Happy 100th anniversary. You wear it well. Dr. Biden, was there a moment early on when you realized that this was somebody who would support you as an equal?
Well, I think I realized it from the beginning, and actually, when I met Joe, and it's kind of a funny story, he did ask me out to marry him 5 times. And finally, I acquiesced. But I have to tell you,
Nevertheless,
It's true, unfortunately.
but,
he persisted.
but you have to hear why. Because at the time when I was dating Joe, his first wife and daughter had been killed in an automobile accident. And he had 2 young sons, Bo and Hunter. And, you know, I fell in love with Bo and Hunter. And, and which is a good thing.
No, it's true. It's a good thing, yeah.
And then?
And then, so it all worked out. But
Everybody knows, seriously, I love her more than she loves me. Everybody knows that.
Well, looking out, Mr. Vice President, looking out at the women in this room, what do they deserve? You've talked about what they deserve from the men they work with. What do they deserve from their partners in life?
Well, I think you deserve to be absolutely treated as an absolute equal. Look, marriage, if you have a partner, whether you're married or not, it has to balance out 50-50. Sometimes you carry more of the load, and it's 60-40, and sometimes the man or your other partner will carry more of the load. But on balance, there has to be respect. Look, every one of you women who work, you can tell the men you work with whether they really respect you or not. You know, not just whether it's a game, whether they genuinely respect you. You know it. You can feel it. You can taste it. You go back and look. 95% of those men were raised by a strong mother. 95% of those men, like me, had a sister and a mother and the people around them, women who were strong and independent. And so you have to insist on that. If you're not treated with respect and dignity, then it is not really love, in my view.
and can I add another thing? I think you need kindness. I think that's so important. And I have to tell you just a little story of what happened this weekend. You know, our son died 2 years ago, but grief is palpable. You never get over losing a child. And so some days are better than others, and so sometimes I have to lift up Joe, and sometimes he lifts me up. And so he knew I was having one of those days this weekend, and so I went out into my car. I was doing an errand, and across my seat was a bouquet of bright yellow flowers. And, you know, that meant so much to me because he knew how I was feeling, and it was just one of those days you just can't explain. They just hit. But I thought that was so kind, so kind that he thought about that and he went out and put the flowers in my car. So kindness is important in a relationship.
I think that's beautiful. So I want to take a couple questions from the audience, but before I do, everybody's wondering who the Democratic candidate for president is going to be in 2020.
We are too. Who is it going to be? We're wondering ourselves.
So I have to ask it. Dr. Biden, when will you declare?
I'm all in on that one.
Joe, would you be my vice president?
I would be a vice president.
But Vice President Biden, you talked about how President Obama asked you, how do you want to spend the rest of your life? And I think that was 2 years ago. How would you answer that question today?
Well, the way I'm doing it now, I was really lucky. When I left the White House, I had planned on running in 2012. We had planned on running. And the very people who I would have had running the administration had I run, I was trying to figure there's a way we can keep us all together, not to run, but to continue to work on the things that have animated my whole life.
16, right?
Did I say?
2016.
Well, no, but in 2012 we decided we were going to run in 16.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
And
Got it?
This is a marriage, it's always like this.
she's almost always right. But all kidding aside, so what I decided to do, I had a great opportunity afterwards, but the University of Pennsylvania gave me a large sum of money and asked me to be a full professor there. Not me the money, gave me money to hire the very people who ran the State Department, who, if I had been elected, who'd be Secretary of State, who'd be Secretary of Defense. I have an incredible first-class team there, and it's a serious intellectual pursuit there. And we're working on all the issues that I worked on my whole life. The University of Delaware did the same thing, gave me $2.5 million for the staff of, again, really top-rate people who, if were I president, would be running the show on the domestic side. And then we did this cancer initiative, and it turned out that a group of Nobel laureates and 21 cancer specialists who run the major hospitals came to me and said, would you keep this going? The moonshots. So there's the Joe and Jill Biden Cancer Initiative, where we have $14 million worth of staff, and we're doing two things. We're breaking down barriers so they start to share data with one another, making significant movement in terms of what I believe will be all of you women, if you're married and have a child, or if you're not married and have a child, when you send that kid to school for their vaccination, they're going to be able to be vaccinated against major cancers, not just HPV, but many other cancers. We're on the cusp of fundamental change. And so I'm already doing it. I'm able, my dad had an expression, he says, a lucky person gets up in the morning, for real. You've heard it, we've heard it many times, my dad. Lucky person gets up in the morning, knows what they're about to do, and thinks it still matters. How many successful people do you know, who are older than you guys, who no longer think what they do really matters? Well, this has been the animating principle of our family my whole life. And so I'm fine right where I am.
All right. I'd love to take a couple of questions from the audience. I see one right here. I believe we have microphones. Right here, sorry.
It's such an honor to see both of you, well, all three of you today. And and I love what you talked about in terms of, like, we're at this moment of cultural change and we're here to celebrate women. But I have a question. As a mother of a son, and I'd love you to speak about what the opportunities and obligations are as we raise our sons to change that other part of the equation.
Should I answer that? Yeah, I think it's the way we've raised our sons, and I really mean this, and it's to say from the very beginning that you have an obligation to treat every single person with dignity and respect, and that the women in your life, all they had to do was look at their mom and see how accomplished she was. Look at my sister and see how accomplished she is. Look at my mom and see. I mean, so that there's no entitlement in being a man. And if you really want to be a man, be prepared to intervene when you see another man abusing or treating with lack of respect another woman.
Yeah, but you have to lead by example like you did, and that's how our sons learned that, Joe.
Well,
And that's how your son hopefully will look at the men in his life and how, they're treated. So,
but as my mom would say, no one's better than you, but you're no better than anyone else. And every single solitary woman, my goal was, when I started running in 1972, was I wanted my daughters, if I had one, I just had one, I was 14 months old, that she would be entitled to every single solitary opportunity my kids were, and there's not a damn thing that a man can do that a woman can't do. I really mean that. There is not a single thing you can't do.
we already knew that, Joe.
No, we knew that, but a lot of people didn't know that.
Next question. I think there's someone with a mic back here. Yes.
My name is Rachel Miller, and my question is for the former vice president. In the context of changing the culture and women being brave enough to come forward, I'm wondering if there is anything that you would do differently with regards to Anita Hill if given the opportunity.
No, let's get something straight here. I believed in Anita Hill. I voted against Clarence Thomas. The only issue in the Anita Hill case was whether or not there could be information submitted in a record without a name attached to it, anonymously accusing someone of something. I'm confident he did what she asserted. And so it got down to one witness who at the last minute decided she did not want to come and testify. And so I wanted to make sure that she understood. So my chief of staff, they went to the hotel where this woman was staying, a very accomplished woman, and said, we want you to testify. She said, no, she didn't want to. I said, well, you sign this affidavit saying you refused to testify. The reason, some argue that I should have made her come and testify anyway. The truth of the matter was, you don't want witnesses who are going to come and testify and be weak in the testimony and undercut the testimony of Anita Hill. Anita Hill was victimized. There is no question in my mind. And every single solitary person on that committee who believed her voted no. It was a tie vote. And so what I do feel badly about is the bad taste that got left in the mouth of some of the people around Anita Hill, and maybe even Anita, about whether or not the witnesses should have been called, who were called and weren't called, et cetera. So maybe I could have handled that better, but I believed her from the beginning. I made her case on the floor. I made her case in the committee.
If I can just follow up on that for 1 second. Professor Hill has said herself that she expected a fair process and did not feel that she had one. Do you, given your leadership on these kinds of issues, do you have any message to her now?
Well, my message, which I've delivered before, is I am so sorry if she believed that. I am so sorry that she had to go through what she went through. Think of the courage it took for her to come forward. And initially, when it came forward, she didn't come forward. Initially, it came forward anonymously. And the question was, would I put it in the record anonymously? But she had the courage to come and say, no, I'll come and testify. And she got put through hell during that process. And if you remember, and if you watch that, the shouting arguments I had with those witnesses who were attacking her. And so, but I feel really badly. She didn't feel like the process worked. But I tell you what, I said something at the time that proved to be right. I said this is going to be the start of a fundamental change of what constitutes harassment in the workplace, and people are going to begin to change. And it began to change because of her courage.
I think we have time for one more very, very quick question. Yes, I know you've had your hand up. Here comes a mic.
Hi, I'm Davy Jagadison. I'm going to be very transparent right now. I'm a survivor of sexual assault, and
God love you.
thank you. So basically, my best friend and I started a company after a couple of injustices at our university. It's called Sparkle. Sparkle is someone's happiness, passion, and self-worth, sometimes taken away by the traumatic event of sexual assault. We developed a bracelet to remind someone of that sparkle. Learning how to build a business, learning what this company could be. I was wondering if you had any advice on how to handle the triggering trauma that sometimes occurs when building this company. A social enterprise is very different from a normal company, which I'm learning very fast. But then also, if you had any comments on the shift and the culture change in universities right now, because it's a huge problem.
Yes, it is a huge problem. That's why I've started and continued the It's On Us program.
Yes, I'm in charge of the It's On X campaign.
And I've been on them and continue to visit campuses, and thousands of people showed up. And the bottom line of all that was when I asked the violence against women staff working for me, and that office, I'd ask them once every 6 to 8 months, go check the Bureau of Justice statistics. And they came back and pointed out that although 67% reduction in abuse against women over 30 years old, for women between 14 and 24, nothing had changed. 1 in 5 going onto a college campus are going to get assaulted or raped. And that's the single biggest reason why women drop out of school and so on. I said something else that caused a lot of controversy at the time when I wrote the bill. I said I'm confident there is going to be long-term physical impacts that are health impacts on women who are abused. And I was told then there's no proof of that. But my view, that was from working with men coming back from, mostly men coming back from war with post-traumatic stress. And if every night that, if a woman's constantly being abused, why would she not suffer from the same consequence? So the CDC now has established without any reasonable doubt that women who are abused end up having long-term physical and physiological problems. And so what I'm working with Lady Gaga now, and Gaga wants to begin a thing with me where we set up effectively trauma centers where women can go to get the long-term help they need to deal with these crises.
Yeah, I see it, from my students as well, because they journal all the time. I teach English, and I see so much of it.
But so there is help. You ought to get a hold of me after this. I'll make sure one of my staff gives you a card. There's a lot going on. It's only now beginning because we finally are recognizing the long-term impacts on the health of women and men who have been abused. And it's the next great frontier I want to be part of. And Gaga's putting, it's a long story, but... Well, thank you for the courage to stand up. And by the way, it's women standing up. You have maybe you do, but I'm not sure you have any idea how much confidence you give women who are abused. Because look, I'm always asked, how do you know when we've succeeded? We succeeded when not a single woman ever asks herself if she's been abused, what did I do? There's nothing you can do other than physically attack someone that justifies any man raising a hand to you. Nothing, period. And until we get through a societal structure here where we say, well, what were you wearing? Were you drunk? Whether you're drunk or not, unless you can affirmatively give consent, it's rape. Unless you affirmatively consent. Anybody engaged in that behavior is committing a crime. And so we got to get by this. So you shouldn't be asking yourself, well, God, I wonder, maybe I shouldn't. What did I say? What was I wearing? I got to tell you one quick story. When I opened up the hearings, I went to a young woman who had, and her name was Marla Hanson. She was a model. And I went to see her ahead of time because she had her face slashed. And so I went to her and I said, would you come and testify? And she said, yes, she would. And I went through what she was about to face because she was going to get ridiculed. She was going to be attacked in the press. You know, when I wrote the law, it was Biden is just setting up feminism indoctrination centers. That's what Biden was. This was in the mainstream press, what Biden was doing, okay? So I sat with her. This is a young woman who wanted to get from a utility apartment, what's it called? Not utility, not a one-bedroom, up to a one-bedroom apartment. Thank you. Efficiency. I said utility. Efficiency apartment in a building. She lived in an upscale apartment complex in the East 80s, East 70s in New York. And she was a model. And every time she'd go to ask about getting a one-bedroom, the landlord would hit on her, constantly hit on her. So she decided she was going to move. She was on a shoot in New York City as a model. She got a phone call saying, I got a one-bedroom apartment. When you get back from work, meet me at the bar restaurant, which is in the first floor of this building. It's it's a mainstream place. So she showed up, and he hit on her again. She got up and walked out. He hired 2 goons who slashed her face with razors. This is now 20 years ago, okay? And so what happened was, I said, now, when you testify, I'm going to ask you the following questions. And one of the questions I asked you, I said, what did your mother say? She said, why were you in a bar? What did your girlfriend say? Well, were you wearing a bra? Did you have underwear on? I mean, how were you dressed? What an ugly question. But it's part of the culture. Somehow, you invited it. My God. That is the sickest thing, but it's changing. Again, it is never a woman's fault. And I'm going to be controversial, which I always am. If one of you got up stark naked and walked out here, you could be arrested for indecent exposure. But no man has a right to touch you, period, under any circumstance.
Bravo. I think that's a great note to end on. Thank you for your bravery in sharing that story. Thank you so much, Dr. Biden and Vice President Biden.